as soon as you make the website fast, then I'll let caching alone. I'll leave it alone.
You can make, what is it, you trade caching and you get like 50 other problems.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see what other people are doing.
Dude, that's how I feel about this. Seriously, that's how I feel about this Rails stuff, where it's like, I don't care. I don't really care as long as it's what everyone else does.
Well, that's the problem.
And that's what I hate about FastBoot is like, I think of all the people that use FastBoot, we're the only ones using FastBoot like how we use FastBoot.
But is that true for everyone who uses FastBoot?
Yeah, I think everyone...
They use it in their own way.
They have FastBoot app server. They have it like... I know someone has it like load balanced behind Nginx. They have their own middlewares in there. We have our own middleware. And it's like, yeah, I know there's always going to be like this configuration stuff. But... yeah.
So wait, talk about the... You said someone has it behind Nginx?
Yeah.
For the purpose of what?
Like load balancing.
So
splitting, not load balancing is a bad term, or the wrong term. Request splitting. So sending API requests to the API servers, FastBoot requests to the FastBoot server.
As opposed to having everything go to FastBoot and have that be the place that proxies things off to different servers.
Yeah, I mean, FastBoot's like we have everything go to Express, and then Express figures out where things go. But the Express instance where everything goes is also the Express instance that serves the FastBoot thing.
And typically those layers are separate.
Right.
The architecture you want is...
We do this because we're using Heroku, and the less Heroku instances we have, it's just easier for us to maintain.
Right.
So we don't want to set up a Heroku instance for Nginx to do routing or HA proxy to do routing.
Right.
We just want one front end, one back end, and you know, things are simple.
I'm smiling because I got you talking about caching. So since we're on the topic, I was just going to ask like a general question, like when it comes to this kind of network architecture. So we're talking about best practices. We're talking about like, I want there to be a Ember way, just like there's a Rails way. Like when you hit certain blocks, like roadblocks, bottlenecks in your architecture, you can say, ask the Rails community, what do I do next?
Yep.
And it feels like the things that are harder to do that add complexity, they're not a fundamental change from how you're doing things to start in the simple way. So they have that property that they decompose. So if you're going to add load balancers, it doesn't mean that you have to start with something other than an app server.
Oh, right. And your app server doesn't even know that it's being load
Exactly.
balanced. I mean, in the sense it gets like these exported for headers,
right.
So it could know, but your architecture doesn't change.
So that's kind of like, that property is really nice because it lets you opt into the complexity as you need it. That's a really good point. So like patterns exist to solve slow Ember apps, and so some of them leverage FastBoot, and caching can be involved, but there's not a clear path yet where, okay, you start off with an Ember app, it serves it up, the client renders everything, it makes AJAX requests great. Then you get a bunch of data and you want to make it faster somehow, or you want OG tags. I mean, that was the first thing for us.
Well, just thinking, going down this road that you're saying, we're talking about caching our FastBoot responses, which means we need to remove user info from FastBoot. So now this is the way our app is architectured.
Right.
So in order to level up, we need to go back and revisit old architecture decisions. And so that
does come up in the Rails side as well, a server, right? Where user auth can affect caching, and if you need to do sophisticated caching,
I mean, yes, like the Rails caching, no, but
because you can say it depends on the user, like the session, like the current user. When you do the Rails, you would say that like these parts, like the user parts of the view, aren't cached, and Rails is going to generate those parts of the view as a request. So that's something you would change. Technically, that would be a change once you start opting into the complexity. That's part of the complexity of caching your responses. Yeah. But maybe it's an easier change because of the niceties of the APIs, as opposed to Ember, which is like, we block initial render on getting current user, and now we have to rethink that. Although, like, that shouldn't be that much of a change that we have to do, but it is a change. I mean, it's a change. Yeah, you know, it's a big enough change that the entire app was built on the assumption that
You always have a current user.
You always have
you have a current user
on initial
service.
render. You don't have to account for that other state,
right?
Where you're going to have these components in like the settings page rendering, and like they don't even haven't even loaded yet.
Right. I absolutely believe there are patterns that we can come up with to make that easier. So in a route, we could say that like this route depends on a current user, and it can't be rendered without one. So like,
just wait until the current user loads, or something. Like
or if you're doing it in FastBoot where it's going to be cached, like you're just caching the app shell.
Right. Right.
So I think we can come up with these patterns, but it's tough because
there's no paved roads there yet,
and
people are doing their own stuff. It's like you were saying at the beginning.
Yeah. Yes. And you hit these points and you're like, okay, now I need to figure out how to solve this.
And even all that stuff set aside, you know, we were talking about just early, a few hours ago was like, so say you have that stuff architected well and you can cache, but now you have the question of cache busting. And so now you have to figure out, because you have like API responses in the back end, and that's like our Rails app is where data is changing, and then you have like Ember templates that are rendering the front end, you need a way to link the dependencies. So you need to say which view or which component depends on this data, so that if it changes, you can change it.
So a good example here is we have a video page, and on the side it's like related videos.
Right.
And then if any one of those related videos change, we have to bust this video page, since FastBoot is generating like all this HTML.
Right.
And that gets hard because there's no direct link between these. I mean, we don't have a direct link between these in our database. So,
right.
So
just to kind of, let's just talk through really quick the idea that we have right now, which is first thinking about the JSON API responses, which is actually pretty nice. It's funny because we keep coming back to this, like there's some things that, you know, are kind of stack lacks that might be easy if we weren't locked into certain abstractions, or we were using something really popular. You know, a lot of folks are talking about GraphQL these days, and we want to explore that, and there's a big community there. But we're also really happy with a lot of aspects of our tools, but there's times where, you know, you run against them. But one thing that we love about JSON API that we keep coming back to is just like the actual spec does such an amazing job.
You can look at a document and you know what's in there.
Exactly. You don't have to know the naming conventions. You know the model type and basically, if you give me a JSON API document and show me your database, I know where it is.
Yep.
And
there's so much more here. It's like with model type, model ID, and then like relationship name.
Yeah.
There's so much you can back out of that.
Yes. So if you think about cache busting and think about a JSON API response, you could have your backend generate the JSON API document, and then you could set up a list of keys that point to each entity, each resource in there. And then you could say on the back end, if any of those resources change, that thing has changed. And then there's a map that exists that says, okay, post 1 has changed. For this URL, this document included post 1, or this document included all posts. So that also needs to be busted. So actually, given the JSON API document, you can set up a map between model ID keys and the URLs that you would need to bust. And once we thought through that, we then thought, okay, well now let's think about FastBoot rendering an entire page, and what are the dependencies of that? Now, if you give me a piece of HTML, this is interesting, right? Because if you give me a JSON API document, I can say, oh, there's the model.
You can point to every record in the database.
Exactly. But if you give me an HTML string, I'm like, okay, let's just purge everything.
That's going to be a pretty gnarly regex string.
Yeah, right? Exactly. So, except the fact that we have this nice abstractions in Ember, and so we actually know the JSON API documents that were needed to render that HTML. And so,
you know, it's kind of pretty cool thing here. Like you can, at the very last line of your template, you can be like, this page probably needed like everything in the Ember data store.
Right.
And that's initial render. Just if it's FastBoot, you have like an initial render.
Right, because it's a single run through.
Yeah. So there could be.
Oh, that's interesting.
So there could be a component. It's the very last line of like your handlebars template, and it's just like, hey, look at the store, and probably everything in the store was used to generate this page.
Interesting.
And so you could say, hey, I know.
But you still have the problem there that if you did a get to posts, and everything in the store is post 1, post 2, and post 3, but now you create a post.
Yes.
So you want to know, it's actually the request that tells you even more.
Yes. Yep. I'm interested in all posts.
Right.
Yep.
But that is really interesting. I mean, a lot of this is like the materialized view, right? It's like one view of the data. But it's pretty cool. So we were thinking, okay, if we can get the JSON API documents keyed in this map, then we can know how to bust a cache if we need to. And then if you look at the render of, let's say, the home page, let's say Ember Data makes 3 different requests. Well, now you can say those 3 different requests, get the keys from all of them, put it into the cache map or whatever. And now you can say, given this HTML page that was generated by FastBoot, here's a map of every resource that would potentially touch this. And now you can bust the cache.
Here's all the requests that were made to generate this. Therefore, I know all the models that could potentially be in this.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So then we're talking about something like Fastly, or even doing our own caching in like the Node FastBoot app server layer. But now you have knowledge that says when things change, what's bust.
Yep.
So just kind of an interesting thought experiment, like interesting little whiteboarding experiment we went through.
Yeah. Here we go, off on our own, building a cache system.
So what is it? Do you know how the caching stuff developed in Rails? Was there a time period where people were doing all their own stuff, and then all of the Russian doll casting and the fragments became standardized?
Yeah, I think there was like a lot of like controller caching and like model caching. And then I remember, I think it was like around Rails 3 or like 3.1, sometime around then. They did the view layer caching, and that was really big. And that the idea here would be, this is where like the Russian doll thing came from, because if you have a view that has like cache fragments, and inside that cache fragment there's other cache fragments, you only end up generating the cache fragments that change. So it's like, you know, your innermost doll busts all the other dolls, but not any dolls in it, or any dolls that are siblings of it. So you can imagine like a page that lists all posts. You cache that, and then you cache each post is also cached. Let's say post 5 changes. Well, your outer cache is busted because something inside of it.
Post.all is different now.
Because, yeah, post.all, or like 5 had changed.
Right.
So post.all has like a different updated at. So the outer doll is cached. But then on the inner dolls, like 1 through 4 stays the same. So you don't need to regenerate those. You can just use those fragments. 5 changes, and then, 6 through 10 changes. And so this idea that this is where like the Russian doll thing came from, where you if you think about this, you didn't throw away the whole index page.
Right.
You only threw away the 5 and the thing that concatenates all those posts together. Right. I remember this was like a really big thing in Rails. I think it was around Rails 3, but someone will correct me if I'm wrong. It just
became a blessed thing that made it into the framework, and that's now, if you were to ask, how do I make my Rails app faster? There's different layers of caching, and that would be there would be a path towards all of them. Basically,
they have like good APIs for caching in the view layer. You can use those in the controller layer if you want to, but I think they encourage you to do it in the view layer.
Right.
And then they also have like cache backends, so you can hook up to like Redis or in memory or like a file system cache. And there's, these all have like, an interface. So if you want to write your own caching thing, you can do that as well.
Right.
I think that's what it is, like having that sort of blessed interface so things can be put in and out. Like you can just swap adapters in and out.
Yeah. I was just trying to think like, what would it look like to get the first layer standardized in Ember? So the thing with Rails is that the view layer is like intimately familiar with the data.
Yep.
Because it's all right there, which makes some of those APIs possible.
I think having an API where you can say like, here are the models that I used, or here's a key that I used to generate this HTML. So you're not ever like looking at the HTML and being like, hey, what's in this? What's in this document? Right. Or like basing it off the URL. That's not enough, because different routes can fetch different data.
Right.
Saying
so there needs to be some key, and it's more general than just a model, because everyone doesn't even use Ember Data, let's say.
Yeah.
So it has to be something like a key.
Yeah, and then maybe there can be like Ember
Data that takes the model and ID and uses that.
And the nice thing about FastBoot is that your app isn't like long lived. So it's like in a client, just data keeps finding its way into the store. But in FastBoot, it's like initial paint, push it out. That's it. So it's generally at the time of render, whatever's in the FastBoot store is needed to render the page.
Right.
You can basically make that assumption. It's like a really safe assumption to make.
Interesting. Unless you're doing a bunch of unnecessary requests or whatever, but yeah, why would you?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
But yeah, so and there is some notion of a caching API in FastBoot App Server with a cache
FastBoot
object. Does it have any
yeah.
of these keys or anything like that? Or?
I think it has like a get and set function you can provide. Again, this feels like since FastBoot App Server is running in Node and is running in Express, I sort of default to like, how are people that are writing Express apps?
Right. This is not leveraging any of the existing caching work that people have been doing for years with any of these technologies, either Express or the layer above, like Fastly network level.
Right. Yes.
Or
which I think is probably more common is that layer above, hidden from
for Ember apps. You're saying, or just
no. In general.
In general.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know if there's enough people using FastBoot to say like what is the best way to do this in Ember.
Right.
So
interesting. Might be good to ask folks.
Yeah.
See what they're doing.
Yeah. a lot of different responses.
Yeah.
So you've been doing some project management.
A little bit. Trying to get my hands away from the keyboard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how's that been working out?
It's not been too bad. Yeah, we were talking about this, like when you're trying to run a project and, not just pretending like you don't know how to code. So it forced you to flex those project management muscles and work on your communication. But sometimes it feels like it's 20x faster to just make a little change than to like communicate.
That's funny because how often are your programming estimates off, or like are they off by a factor of 20x? Because then you can be like, well, it's
it's worth it.
Well, no, it's just it's even.
Oh, right.
Because if you think it's going to be 20x faster, but your programming estimates are 20x off,
they probably are. Yeah, so I've been, one of our consulting projects, been doing less coding, more product side. So closer with the client, figuring out what the needs of the product are. We have some folks working with us, and just using like a pretty lightweight process with Trello, like a few lists, doing, done, and then like we have an up next. It's hard. So at the beginning we were doing mock-ups. Like I did a lot of mock-ups for the initial version. Of course, those things fall out of sync, but they were super helpful at the beginning. I think those are very high bandwidth. So thinking in terms of like communication and like the bandwidth of what you're sending, mock-ups are great because they just answer so many questions. And even when something's clear to us, especially we're familiar with this app, and it's like, oh yeah, just add a modal there with like this and this button, and we know what it's supposed to look like. So I could just write that in 2 sentences, and if someone with my knowledge would be able to take that and build the thing. But then it's like, how do you communicate that to someone? So, just dealing with lots of these problems, like how to make this even more efficient, how to make the feedback loops faster. And again, like this, it kind of goes back to like, I think part of me gets frustrated with when processes have to change, just like with the caching conversation we were just having, like your architecture, it's great if you can just add layers when you need more complexity. Mm-hmm. So I like to believe that there's a process that would work for Facebook that decomposes to a 2-person team
that you can just slowly layer up.
Yeah, but it's not like it's completely different now. But I think the reality is right now it is completely different. But I do have hopes of one day using like a product that can help work this stuff. Trello is very unstructured. It's very flexible. It's up to you to come up with all the constraints. Something that helps you with the mock-ups and the acceptance criteria and all this stuff. So, we were talking about, we also started talking about this both in the context of this consulting project and also EmberMap, because we were talking about, we have our own Trello graveyard of stuff we'd like to add to EmberMap or improvements we'd like to make. And the question is like, what process is going to work best for us? And I feel like we change up our processes. Like sometimes we do things for 3 or 6 months and they work really well, and then we just need to change it up. So like we were trying like a 12-week year, which is like having quarterly estimates, but a year is too long for a company as small as ours. And instead make it a 12-week year. So each week is a month. And so a quarter is 3 weeks. And so you're like, where would we like to get by? Let's focus the first quarter on performance and the second quarter on onboarding. And like that worked pretty well for us, I remember. And then we just kind of stopped doing it.
Yeah.
And then, we have like the Trello boards where we've set those up. We had like, marketing and content and R&D and all this stuff. And then again, those kind of just fell by the wayside. So
it's really good for organizing your ideas. But then when you look back after like 6 months, it's just kind of like, well, I organized my ideas.
Right.
Didn't do anything else.
Exactly.
So
there was this idea we were talking about things that are really important and they'll just come back up. So it's almost like you want a tool or a system that automatically gets rid of things that aren't being used after 2 weeks or something. I mean, really.
Or it just says like, you talked about this 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
You talked about this 2 months ago, and it keeps coming up, and it's also like keeps coming up more frequently. And then maybe that, okay, this is maybe an important thing.
Right. Another part of this that we were talking about that I found really interesting was the bugs versus the features. So, in software, we talk about bugs and features. And lately I've been thinking that sometimes it's not the most helpful way to think about it. So let's set the stage a little bit. So you have the open source, you have the project management on the open source side of things. So remember we were looking at Lodash and how he runs that and how he kind of does this triage with new issues by closing them and marking them as either like bugs or feature requests. And then he focuses on bugs. Okay, so the question is like, what is a bug? So if you're making a calculator and you press 1 + 1, you hit equals, and you get 3, that's a bug. And everyone understands that. So if you're shipping a library like Lodash and you use like _.add 1 + 1, and then it's 3, it's like that's a bug and that needs to be fixed. Then there's things that are like feature requests, like your calculator doesn't support exponentiation and I want it to. So that's a feature request. It doesn't exist. But then there's all this stuff in the middle, and we were talking about it in the context of some of our open source work in EmberMap, where it's like this part of the...
Let's stick with like a Lodash example.
Yeah,
I was thinking like your map function in Lodash doesn't pass the index. It's like the second parameter.
Exactly.
So that's like, is that a feature or bug? Like what should that have?
Exactly. And like, what's the point of marking something a bug or a feature? I mean, it feels like in the case we were just talking about, the bug is pretty important. Like it's broken software, you would say, right? It's broken software if 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah.
And you kind of package this up in a nice way. You said this in a nice way, which is like, I think about a bug as if part of my software is not working as intended. So like, what if you ship a modal, like you have a form and you ship a feature and you hit save and like it works. And then you ship it and then you have like a bad endpoint and it errors and like you didn't code the error state.
That feels more in the bug category because the user is going to click save and then just not know what happened and really not know that their thing didn't save because they're not seeing an error. They're not seeing that error state.
Right. It feels like broken software.
Yeah, that feels more like the bug. Now, if you were to like change this and be like, okay, so the user clicks save and it takes like 20 seconds to save it.
Right.
Then I'm like, okay, I don't know. Like that feels, I mean, I would say that's a bug. But like, where is that? I don't know where that is.
And like, what's the purpose of saying things are bugs versus features to begin with? Going back to the Lodash example, it's like, this is broken, so this feels high priority. But there's stuff like the slow save or the error state that's not coded that is not the number one priority. Like we would work on new things before those.
There are absolutely bugs that are just known and yeah, exactly, not a high priority.
So when it comes to prioritization, sometimes you would take a feature over a bug.
Yeah.
But the reason you would identify something as a bug or a feature is Why?
Maybe just like communication on like the team and in the organization. Like when your developers are working on a set of features, it's like we are adding new things to the product. And when your developers are working on bugs, it's like we're fixing existing things in the project. So maybe using this as a way to communicate what's being worked on.
Right. And then it's also like on consulting projects, sometimes you ship something and then there's some feedback and then they're like, oh, this thing doesn't work. Make it do X. And X is really a feature, but they think of it as a bug.
Right. And this goes back to like that communication stuff you were talking about earlier.
Right.
Yeah.
So the reason I was thinking about all this was because of how it affects what we work on, what we choose to work on next. And there's times where, okay, saying something is a bug because it doesn't work as intended, like I'm okay with that. That sounds like a reasonable thing. Although I still think it's kind of like a continuum and it's hard. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's one of those things, it's like, I don't know how to define it. I just know it when I see it, you know? That doesn't mean it's a bad definition. It just means that there's a continuum there. But I was thinking about this because maybe sometimes like a better way to think about it is in terms of stability. And there's also this idea that part of software is discovery. And no matter what, when we think about things ahead of time, you can spend a week coming up with a card, and until you actually code it, you're not going to know everything.
Right.
So maybe even until someone uses it. So
even a better way to put that is just you know least about this thing right now.
Yes. And you're going to ship a feature and it's going to be, something's going to happen in a way you didn't anticipate or expect or intend. So really it's like there's this notion of like stability in our software. And when we add something to it, like there's parts of our app or parts of our user flows that are more stable or less stable. And so we were trying to think about this and say, oh, there's this aspect that's like buggy. It feels like a bug. And we were saying that because it's like so confusing or so not how we would intend it to be that it needs like, it basically needs like high priority, right?
Right.
Like the calculator being broken, 1 + 1 = 3. There's something to that saying it's not intended, but there's also something there that's like, this is really important. We need to fix it.
Well, I just thought something interesting, like the calculator being broken is like provably correct.
Right.
Our onboarding flow being broken, it's like if someone else had built that, we'd be like, okay, that's not, you didn't really capture like what we wanted.
Right.
Now we look at it as a bug because
right.
we're like the same people that are driving the product and
right.
coding it. But there's something where it's a communication breakdown. It's
I wonder if there's one thing that's separate. So you have feature and bug over here, but then there's another dimension that you can describe all of these issues. The same dimension that you can apply whether something's a bug or a feature that helps us better think about how to prioritize things. Because if something is a bug, but it's an edge case, you can even have a bug that's provably false.
Don't teams do this in like priority? Like they'll say like
right, but I'm talking about like yes, but like how do we talk about it? So like I think people think about like bugs. People sometimes say things like this shouldn't have any bugs, or we're going to fix all the bugs and then ship a 1.0. There's no open bugs in our issue. People say stuff like that, and it makes, when you think about it, it's like, yeah, it's a bug, it's broken, it needs to be fixed. But what I'm saying is like, okay, well, you could even have a bug that's provably false, like you were saying, but it's so edge casey that it actually is super low priority.
Or I was like, you could have a bug that a client has come to rely on.
That's true.
And then you can't fix it because...
Well, in that case, it's a feature, not a bug. But what if you just have a bug that's just... Or you have a bug that's like really hard to fix and it's not worth it. No one cares. They just avoid that edge case of the app.
Yeah, a bug that only shows up 10% of the time.
You just refresh the app and it works, you know?
Yep.
Fixed. So I feel like it would be, bringing it all the way back to like being more in this more project manager role, trying to communicate, priority and urgency. And, a lot of times we do have something like a Trello backlog, a Kanban style, where we have features and bugs and we add things there and then we pull them off and put them into a single prioritized backlog. And sometimes I think the bug and feature stuff is actually not as helpful. Like sometimes it feels like it's not as helpful.
I would say, as putting on my developer hat, I don't really mind what I'm working on.
Yeah.
I don't care if you're calling it a bug and it's really a feature.
Right.
I don't care if it's really a feature and you're calling it a bug.
Right.
As long as it's prioritized,
right.
I think that makes the developer story go a little better.
I agree. And I also think there's some tension that could be saved, because if you, developer, I'm project manager, and I say, do feature X, and you do it and we ship it, and then maybe I user test it, maybe I send it to the client, they get some feedback back, and then I come to you, and what am I going to say? Like,
can you fix this bug?
Yeah, and that's crappy.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like,
as a mature developer, like
someone says that, and I'm just like, okay, sure. Like, what? There's not like
I
don't ever think like, oh, I did everything to spec. My software is perfect. I don't ever think, even though my software is perfect, I don't ever like. I'm like, okay, like what should we change? Like I look at it as we got feedback and now we need to change things.
But isn't it frustrating when things come back and they're presented as if like you did it wrong? And I'm not doing this, by the way. I'm also a perfect project manager. I'm just saying, like, hasn't there been times where we've worked on things and people are like, what? You end up building something that doesn't work out because, again, there's this discovery process.
Right. It is frustrating if we don't share a common language.
Yeah.
Like if the project manager is saying everything's a bug when it's not a bug, that's frustrating because there's not a common language. I think, you and your project manager, you and your developer are in this together. So you want
to be able to speak about it. This doesn't work quite as expected, or we want this to be more stable or something like that.
You want to be reading each other's minds, right? You want to like just, so if there's not a common language, if there's like, wait, that's not a bug, what are you talking about?
See, that's why
I think that's problematic, but
that's why I think there could be better language here, maybe, where it's like, you want to do it, okay, we made this change, we moved the project from this point to this point, and now we have new knowledge and new information, and now we want to have these new deltas that we have in mind, and so we're going to work on this one. It's going to bring it from here to here.
So rather, I think the way I would approach this is, rather than trying to change the language around feature and bug, I would try to do exactly what you just said and get the team to ship faster.
Yeah.
Get them to sort of
less
not
try the burden of a bit of a change, like of a single feature.
You're not building, version 3.
Right.
You have all you're looking at is the next 5 days, and then you have like some more senior folks that are thinking about, okay, how does like the architecture affect the next few years? But you're not. You've got to get this feature perfect, and you've got to work on it for 3 months and.
Because basically then you come to expect things, you're going to be learning things all the time, and things you're going to be tweaking things that you've done in the past, and that's just part of development.
And going back to like, just how does it feel as a project manager, developer, if you work on something for a week and turns out it's wrong, that doesn't feel bad. If you work on something for a year and it turns out it's wrong, that feels pretty bad.
Right.
So just shortening those feedback loops.
Right.
I think it's going to be really, really hard if you went into like an engineering organization and we're like, okay, we're no longer going to use the word feature or bug. I think people would be like, there's the door.
Yeah. No, I believe that. And sometimes it's just, I think about also, we've talked about different software for managing this stuff, and Trello and Pivotal and GitHub issues, and looking at Lodash's workflow for all that, for that, John had to make all that stuff up, and there's something to be said for help with triage and prioritization is super hard. And if you feel like everything's at the same level and you open up an issues list and it's huge, I mean, we know this all the time from our projects. So bug and feature is like one step there, where we were trying to like emphasize, we don't like when we have bugs in our software and our open source projects, you're going through the getting started and you hit a bug, it sucks. So we'd rather fix those and like fix documentation than like add a bunch of features. But then there's also like things that are really high priority that you need to work on. So it's like, what language, what tools can help us with this? And I think what you're saying is correct. And I think part of this is figuring out shared language, obviously. I'm also just on the lookout for ways that our tools can help with this.
A tool, especially a tool that like a process that decomposes.
Right. Right.
Would be just
right. So
amazing.
You can start your new thing, but then you turn it on. There's a triage step. Like everything has to be like everything that goes into an inbox, and there's something that happens to it where.
By the way, we're talking about this from like purely from the project management and software.
Yes.
Like point of view, but there's so many other. There's like the sales cycle.
Yeah.
There's just so many other factors that you go into some organizations and it's just a developer can't tell you what they're working on tomorrow. It's just their boss is going to say fix this, or there'll be just a new report from a user, and that all of a sudden is the highest priority.
That's true.
So there's a lot. Like there's just. I mean, we're having a hard time breaking it down in our little like vacuum.
Yes.
And then if you layer in more organizations, more stakeholders, I think it gets even harder.
But I feel like there's probably a lot of people in our boat where you have 100 things that you want to do, and the question is how best to think about those. How should we think about them? How should we break them up? We're gonna try there's this idea of. Instead of dropping all of our thoughts and ideas and bugs and enhancements into a Trello and trying to prioritize it and groom it, and it gets really big, it's like what we're going to do is focus on onboarding for the next 4 weeks. And we're going to take a user flow, go through the site, and identify the things that we want to improve. And some of that's going to come from stuff that we've identified before, but some of it's going to come from that audit. And we're going to get performance things from that. We're going to get bugs from that. We're going to get enhancements from that. But it's going to be related to this user flow that we want to improve. And that's what we're going to try next.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this.
Yeah,
because I think that a lot of times we talk about like the software triangle.
Yes.
And not only shipping functionality but usability. What else is in the triangle?
Yeah, delight.
So us saying like improve caching, maybe that like does usability, some functionality, but we're not really thinking about delight when we're doing that.
Right.
So I really like this idea of just like, okay, I'm a user and I'm onboarding. I'm this specific type of user and I'm onboarding, and I feel like we're going to hit all these things.
A bunch of stuff. You also have the value in mind the whole time.
Yep.
Which is the whole point of software.
Yes.
Deliver user value.
Yeah.
Whereas if you open a Trello board and you see, get rid of unused colors, you know what I mean? You want to tie, even tech debt removal can be tied back to value, but it changes it when you're thinking about that versus when you're just looking at a bunch of features and bugs.
Yeah. This is interesting. And then going back to I was just talking about like a large group with many different stakeholders. I mean, there's no easier way to build the software that you want to build than tying it to user value.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's report back in a month and see.
Yeah. See. So this week I spent most of my time working on 2 different features. The first feature was getting FastBoot to take our pages that are rendered by an Ember app and deliver these Twitter cards that embed like a player on Twitter. So you're scrolling through your timeline, you can see a video of us, and you can actually play the video with our video player right in your Twitter timeline. It's super cool. The amount of power and trust that Twitter gives you
so it's using an iframe.
It iframes in your
and
video.
It's
player.
Actually making a request to your to embermap.com.
Yep. Twitter is making a request that pulls it in, and then or I guess when I was debugging it was Twitter, but yeah, the actual app will be making a request to our domain.
Right.
The user has to interact with it, so just scrolling through the timeline isn't enough. Like people that are scrolling through your timeline or their timeline are not going to start hitting your web server.
Right.
They have to interact with your content. But once they do interact with it, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do. So we have an Ember app to get this working. I wanted to see if I could do this in FastBoot, not have to ship an Ember app in an iframe. I just wanted to I knew what the HTML was. I just wanted to take it from FastBoot, display it in the iframe, not initialize an Ember app in Twitter. That just seems really bizarre to me. Also too,
you have a 30-inch screen in landscape in portrait mode, and you have 9 Ember apps being rendering 9 different cards.
Yeah. So I knew what I wanted to do here, and I wanted to like keep it in Ember, and it's just like, this is like the sort of thing it took. I mean, it just took so much of my week. Like it took all the time.
Yeah.
This other feature I was working on was completely unrelated, but building like a better UI for our video pages. So this idea that when you visit a video page, it would like play in the background with an overlay. So you'd like see some movement on the page. When you visit a page, you know that like, oh, hey, that thing's a video. I can start to interact with it. It's using like our EmberMap video player. So like I just had to, add a few options. Like, has the user interacted with this thing yet? When it hasn't been interacted with, it gets this overlay. Our video player does like metrics. So we measure how far people get in the video. But if it's background playing, I don't want to measure the metrics.
Seems like an easy way to make the stakeholders happy.
Can we have our VC funding now? Look at this growth.
Yeah, seriously.
So, like, this feature took me like 2 hours to build. It was with testing.
Where our video player is used, though, it has this ability.
Yeah, and like I made like a guard around the actions hash. So if you fire like these video event tracking actions, like they basically don't get fired when the user hasn't interacted with it. I mean, think about like from an Ember component point of view, like it's so easy to tell if your user has interacted with your page. You just know they like when they've clicked or when they've scrolled, just all this stuff.
Right.
So it made me think like, it was like, okay, these 2 things I work on. One was just like so painful.
Brutal.
It's just so brutal. And the other was just such a delight. It's like I did it in 2 hours with
that's crazy.
With tests, and like it's responsive, and I just thought like there are some things I have to figure out with mobile, but I did most of it. It's air quotes done. In 2 hours, and it was delightful.
Yeah.
It made me think, it was like, man, I really want Ember to just double down on all these things it's really good at and delightful, and just like cut off all these bad things. Maybe part of that's like, it's up to me to like draw a boundary. It's like, you cannot do this in Ember. If it falls on this side,
you can't write servers in Ember.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I ended up doing, is that server code, that iframe code is all Rails.
Yeah.
And I just, there's code duplication between what Ember uses and what the Rails views use, but it's so small that I don't really mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of want like, I don't know what this looks like in practice. I don't know, like, is it just up to me, my responsibility to say like, okay, sure, you can do that in Ember, but we're not, because we're going to hate ourselves.
Right. Or
like, is it more of like a community? That's one end of the spectrum. The other end is like, there's a community thing that says like, yeah, we don't like, FastBoot is not officially supported by Ember.
Right.
Not that I have a problem with FastBoot. It's server, trying to render Ember on the server is not like officially supported.
Yeah, I mean, you've said this before. The parts of Ember that are the golden parts are at such a high level that as Ember developers, you expect that level of support and stability from anything that has the Ember name on it. And when it doesn't work out, you feel like gypped or something. Right. So like Ember and Ember add-ons are amazing, and like they work amazingly. And then you say, yeah, you're trying, all of a sudden now, just by virtue of having this FastBoot thing, even if the core code of FastBoot works extremely well, and you've extended your domain to now server land, and now the concerns are huge there. And so now you're talking about like authentication and server and all this stuff, and you're like, right? So that's the problem. Like that's the problem where it becomes about your expectations about how hard this thing is going to be, and those expectations are blown because this is a completely new domain. I mean, it reminds me of, we've talked about...
It's a domain that Ember doesn't have 6 years of experience in.
Exactly.
Because like, why is Ember CLI, or why is Ember's router so amazing?
Right.
Because it has years of experience. It's been battle tested. Yes. It's just, and there is that, when I see something with the Ember name on it, like I expect, like there's things I expect. I expect it to like convention over configuration. I expect it to be easy to test. What else?
Yeah, you expect other people to be doing it. Yeah, docs and just other people to be using it. Like it's a conventional solution. I'm not on my own. I'm not making things up that I'm going to regret in a year or two.
That's true too. I can. It's like what we always say. You can open any Ember code base, and you just kind of know where you're at.
Yeah. So if you spend 3 days writing your own code, trying to do something, and you know you're off the beaten path, then it's like, yeah, you're going to be bummed out. We've talked about this with how Ember compares to React or other front-end libraries that take a smaller chunk. And you're never going to get blamed. Like if you have a bad time doing server-side rendering or doing state management, well, React doesn't concern itself with those things. So it does take a chunk of it and just doubles down on it, and that's the focus. So that's a good thing. Now, the fact that Ember has cast a wider net, it's a bigger tent. It involves more concerns. Mm-hmm. I love that because I don't want to make all those decisions.
Absolutely.
But it's also the reality that it just becomes hard. It becomes a resource issue. It becomes a complexity issue. There's things like state management is a good example that end up being way more complex than you would originally think. So, you talk about software as a discovery process and zoom back to the beginning of Ember and you're like, okay, we have a rendering layer. We need a data management layer, and so we'll just like copy these other APIs that we like and think about, but then it ends up being super complicated. And so
that's interesting. So if we go on this premise that like the software is discovery, we can't say we're not going to do that thing because it's too complicated, because we don't know it's too complicated until we do it.
Yeah.
So how do you
combat that?
The doubling down on what we're good at? I guess there's two ways to combat it. One is just say, kind of the React way, just say no to everything.
Right.
Someone else will write a library that fills that need.
Right.
Or this kind of, okay, we'll try it and then we'll kill it if it turns out to be too hard.
Yeah.
Or it turns out that it just doesn't meet. We have like a certain threshold that it has to meet, and if it doesn't meet that threshold, it gets cut.
And I also think, again, this is something else we've talked about before, which is just this whole idea of things decomposing. And so I think, the core team has talked about this before. For the last year or two, the approach they've taken with Ember is to do less things in core, but enable things to build on top and then fold them back in so that they're not limiting experimentation, but that there's still a path to get things on a conventional way.
Yep.
So, this has come up. We've talked about this with Mirage, talked about this with like Grunt and Gulp when they first came out. And when Broccoli was being designed, the idea is like you want your core library to be small and to embrace like plugins. Same with like Ember CLI deploy. I think the way that these software projects become stable and meet expectations is by taking off that chunk. Instead of saying, it's hard, right? Because on the one hand, you want to say you want to start outside in, and what's the developer experience of doing this thing from the outside in. And for it to be the ideal, what you want it, then you need to control the parts.
Yeah. So
you're going to discover all this stuff that you didn't know was there. And really the safer way is to make the core and let people build on top of it, but that core doesn't have to change. It has a small concern, and that way you're not going to get stuck with a big software project that has all these holes and it bites people.
So how do you define that core? Like how do you...
It's a good question. I mean...
Because if you think about like FastBoot is...
So, okay, Ember and add-ons is one example. Like, but they didn't even know what the APIs were for the add-ons until later. But the idea there is like, what would an add-on reasonably expect to be able to hook into a host app to do? Modify the build pipeline, ship components, import CSS and JS.
Add whatever it's called. What's the word I'm looking for?
Require
things. Yeah. Things you can require.
Modules, there you go. But the idea there is like, right, maybe originally you would think Ember needs a router, but maybe it just needs a core that can have an add-on that as a router, provides a router.
Now I'm all over the place in this conversation, so I'm like arguing like 7 different opposing views. But if you add something where like anyone can make their own router, do we ever end up with like 100 Ember apps and there's 20 of them look this way with router A, 20 of them look this way with router B. Like, do they all just... do we lose those, like...
The cohesion.
Yeah.
I think it's a good question. I mean, it's hard. There's a trade-off.
Yeah, I guess we don't know.
We don't know. It's a counterfactual, and you'd have to see how that would play out. I think there's things you can do in the design that nudge the community one way or the other. So if you say, here's my little thing, you need something, just go npm install it and figure it out. That's going to encourage the 1,000 roses bloom thing or whatever. Mm-hmm. If you say like, here's the official data solution being worked on, here's the official router being worked on, maybe you can nudge the community to agree around a certain thing. And again, it's hard. There's just so many concerns. So bringing this all back to your FastBoot stuff.
Yeah, I want to talk about, so FastBoot, I mean, FastBoot is super well defined. There's basically one API, app.visit. It does a good job. I mean, it does what it's supposed to do. It visits a page and renders it. Mm-hmm. I think part of the trouble with FastBoot is there's all these other, like, you can say that FastBoot is this thing, it's one API, but in reality, there's all these other concerns. If you want to set up FastBoot, there's all these other concerns you need to be aware of. Like, how do you test it? How do you host it? There's just all these other things that, like, if you're running a FastBoot app, these are decisions that you need to make. So I guess you should say, like, FastBoot is actually...
It leaks because your Ember app is now running in a different environment, right? So I'm trying to think, let's just really quickly, like, what would be other ways to create APIs that folks could experiment with so that you felt like you weren't stuck with the only way to do it and you could just use, bringing it back, like caching in Node would be easy because I would just use the express way to do caching as opposed to figuring out in like a FastBoot API. So maybe it's like...
it's like giving. So I've always like giving.
Maybe like the templates, the rendering stuff you would have access to in a server. Like maybe the Ember app.
Exactly. I was thinking you don't run AJAX requests. Right. Like there's another way to give data to your templates.
Right.
And you can write it in a way where it's. I might just be making a huge circle here. That's something that someone else has already. Basically, the FastBoot team has like, we already thought about that.
Already gone through that.
But something where it's like you can have a route handler that runs on the server that does, you can write an SQL query,
right.
And then and you can have like an ORM that works in both environments. But then it's like, okay, did we just make this super complex ORM?
Yeah,
that needs to run on the browser and the server.
Yeah. It's tough.
I think what it comes down to is FastBoot is not just app.visit. There's more concerns, and those are things that you don't realize until you actually start running a FastBoot app.
I do wonder though, how maybe there's like two kinds of software, and one of them is like, one is this kind of program that works out as this small core thing, and you don't notice it at first. But the reality is a server, instead of like needing to, even like a Rails server or a Node server, and you're like, oh, of course I need routing and I need an ORM. And then you realize, wait, a server request is just this thing that happens. And so if I can define a pipeline, a step of middlewares, then I can delegate all that work out as long as I have some reasonable rules around all this stuff. And then, it's the same thing with like Ember. Maybe Ember says it needs routing, it needs all this stuff. But then it's like, oh, wait, this actually works really well as like this core. So is all software either like that, or it needs to be like this holistic thing, or is like every software can become this thing and it just takes time to realize it? And so with the FastBoot
every software,
every program,
become just a stack of middleware, is what you're saying?
Basically, every program that's like a library that's used by others. And that is going to have feature requests on it. Like, I'm trying to think. It's not well defined. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. But bring it back to this FastBoot stuff where it's like, to make FastBoot work, you have these 10 feature requests. Like, I need to be able to render Twitter cards from my Ember app. I need to be able to cache things from my Ember app. Like I need to be able to do authentication and load balance and all these things that leak into FastBoot. And those become feature requests on FastBoot, and we have to think about how to do it. But it's the same thing with Ember or with Node or Rails. Once you realize that you can come up with a lower level map, a set of rules, all of those things can be delegated out. And so I wonder if eventually we'll figure out what that looks like for FastBoot, where there's the APIs that you need to expose are things like, app.render this URL, like app.render this URL. And
I mean, that
in data.
Okay, I see. That is the API today.
Right, but it's like, you see what I'm saying? It's like what they say, rationalize the pieces that are going into this, and you expose those low-level APIs and the rules of the system, and then you have people able to experiment with caching for those rules. There's ways you can specify cache keys and dependencies of this template. There's services that share data, and you can, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But it's really hard to think about. But I wonder if that's the right way to approach it.
Yeah, I would say it feels impossible to think about. It feels like you would have to go through that pain, let an API emerge from that pain.
But I wonder if you asked like the core team on Ember, let's say, I think if they were other projects that they're working on now and they're things that they're taking on, they're much more cognizant of this. They're thinking about this, and they're going to not just say, they're not just going to start with a single thing. They're going to say, how can we take a small core and delegate out stuff? Because we don't want to lock everyone into one thing.
Thinking back to that, I might be getting too into the details here, but thinking back to that FastBoot example, it feels like you would have to just open up so many Ember APIs. Let me render this component. Let me in isolation, let me do this one little thing in my app. Let me generate a link to in isolation.
Right.
Let me do this in isolation. It feels like in order to get FastBoot to what you just said, which sounds awesome, there's so much work to do.
And this is just like the classic small public interface thing in OOP, which is you want a small public interface because every new public method you expose means there's a new consumer independent on it, makes it harder to change. So the fact that there's only
because Ember exposes so many methods, when you start to run it on the server, it's tough.
But that's why app.visit is nice, because if that's literally the only public API of FastBoot, I mean, it's not. If is FastBoot, that's an API that FastBoot adds.
Yeah, okay. And then you have the request in FastBoot,
right?
And you can inspect the request,
which is crazy, but yeah,
mind blowing.
In a good and bad way. But app.visit, that's the only thing. So that's nice because it lets the FastBoot team and the code base evolve better. It's better because it's only one interface to it.
Yep.
But sometimes it might be nice to have those lower level things to experiment. So
interesting.
It'll be interesting to see where it ends up.
I'm thinking about, I'm working on these rendering tests, and they let you, with the rendering tests, you can render your components and helpers without a routing layer. You can do all this. And so I'm wondering if there's something there that you can use on the server to generate, I don't need routing in FastBoot. I guess I need to generate link tos.
Well, think about everything in an Ember app that you don't need on a server to generate a single request. I mean, there's so many things. Ember is designed to build a stateful application. When you're just running through a request and building up a page of HTML is a completely different thing. Yeah. So, link tos with a model or without a model. There's no links. There's no clicking in FastBoot. There's no clicking. There's no submitting forms. There's nothing.
No events.
There's exactly. So maybe that's part of it. But if you could rationalize those things and say, this is a part of the Ember app that's concerned with rendering given this data in a page or whatever.
If only there was a file in our Ember apps that were concerned with rendering given some set of data. That was declarative. Yeah, that was declarative,
So maybe that's part of it.
That would be pretty cool. Earlier I just said you don't need routing, but I guess you do need routing because you have like outlets that matter.
You don't need the router as a state machine. Right. I mean, you need because you're not changing
like
states.
Model hooks,
you're not changing states. Right, you just need a waterfall. Like you need the waterfall of current.
Right. Master detail waterfall.
Exactly. Like you just need to know the hierarchy, the view hierarchy. You need to know which components render, which the router tells you, but you don't need the fact that the router is a state machine to change from one state to another. You're not changing from state to state.
Do you know of anything that's like...
But you need the data requirements as well. Like whatever parts of your Ember app that are concerned with declaring the data needs for a template, those are important too. But that's fine. Like that still fits within this like middleware stack idea where like you before model, after model, setup controller, render. That's like the stuff you need.
Interesting. Yep.
It's not like the clicks and the fill-ins and...
I feel like over the years, Ember has done a really good job nudging us in the right direction for how we treat things like before model,
yes.
after model. I don't have a lot of crazy code in those. My crazy code lives elsewhere.
Yes, exactly.
But I feel like those are
well constrained, well defined.
If basically there were really strict rules around those, I'd be like, okay, sure, I can comply.
Right.
So FastBoot.
Right. So you could say, what's the critical path to the initial render? That's like what you want Ember to do. That way you don't have guards in did receive, did update, did insert element did receive add.
Did receive, yeah.
Because or add-ons that are using window or something like that. It's just like it doesn't matter because I get it, it's hard. I'm just saying there's this idea that there's a large part of our Ember apps that are concerned with post-initial render, which are basically irrelevant for as far as FastBoot is concerned. And so the question is if you could expose that critical path somehow.
Do you see like a programming model where it's like you're thinking about your application, like from when you sit down to write code, you're kind of thinking about your application as initial render and then post-initial render? Like, could you see that?
The thing here is like, okay, so we talk about handlebars a lot, and this is an awesome example of this. But the thing here is that like the whole render and re-render stuff, you want to be thinking about that with building a stateful application because it's so core to it. It's so difficult a problem, updating the update program and the render program and which parts of your program can change and which parts are static. So it's just they're two different things. So maybe they don't neatly. Maybe you can't neatly take the initial render program and just add on the update program on top.
You can't draw that line.
Yeah, it's like you want to be thinking about those differently when you're working on the stateful app versus when you're working on like a single web page. But maybe not. I'm not sure. Regardless, I think
you say that, and I tend to agree. But then, like the way I approach handlebars templates is the way I approach Rails templates.
Yeah, it's exactly. Like, it is a declarative. It is given the state. This is what it should look like. And if the state changes, who cares? Like the template describes it. So you could just do it. I don't think maybe it shouldn't change it. Maybe it's just about all the wiring that happens after the fact. I'm not sure, but I know, aren't there other frameworks that are doing basically that, where you just get the template and you call render, but you're not doing it as part of...
Next has some API where you can do the server rendered, and there's like a server rendered handler or something like that. I think there are other things. I have no idea what it's like. I don't know if you're just like you run into a different set of problems with these. Right. I gotta believe like just server rendered JavaScript is just a difficult new problem it's hard.
Right.
I know it's hard.
Right. And maybe, again, flash forward a couple of years, maybe you are thinking about this from the beginning. So, like Meteor. Is Meteor still around?
Yeah, I think so.
So this also makes me think of like server-driven state changes. So this is something you don't think about when you first build an Ember app. I click this button and I do this thing. And then you start to think, okay, wait, I click this button, it changes the state and does this thing. And now the state can change in other ways.
Yep.
what if I get fired, but I left my Ember app up on my laptop over the weekend? Do I open it up and I still have access? No, like you need to have an event or something that updates the state. So so your client doesn't get stale. And so the question is like, maybe that just takes time for that to become something that people are automatically thinking of. And maybe there's APIs within Ember that help us do that. So it's like, that push us towards that pattern of building apps that are resilient to things like server-driven state changes and initial renders where no update program is ever going to happen. I mean, I think that's possible. Yeah. I mean, I think Handlebars already does that, right? So like Handlebar with if and else and each, we're already at a point where if the data changes in a way we haven't expected, our template's going to be accurate because Handlebars gives us those guarantees.
Yes. Yep.
So, and they could get further and further with other APIs if they replace and make Handlebars helpers for, let's say, or components for whatever. And so maybe there's APIs that go even up further where we fetch data and where we render our app and redirect and stuff that helps us think about it in a way that's not going to cause problems when we have to do an initial render on the server or something like that.
Exciting.
It's a tough problem, I think. You sound excited about it. No, I think you're just you're jaded a little bit.
It's hard. I'll be the first person
hard
to say that.
It's also cool.
I'm thinking of like what's a better spot to be in? Like you're using a framework that covers so much of this stuff, and you kind of like when someone in Ember figures out the best way to do something, I'm going to get that. Like that's a pattern that's going to find it might take like a year, but it's going to find its way back to my app. And it's great when, I've got a million things to do. If there's one less thing I don't have to think about, it's amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, the flip side for the other argument is that, as these things change, I can just start throwing away blocks of code and plug in more pieces. I get that it's almost
and you're not blocked.
It's not even about, I guess being blocked is frustrating.
Yeah.
But it's like the architecture is forced to be decomposed because they're basically saying we don't know the abstraction and therefore we can't build a good abstraction.
Right. I mean, there's something to that.
Yeah.
There's something to recognizing that.
So going back to what started this conversation, Ember doubling down on what it's good at. I wonder if there's something where it's like we don't know a lot about these problems.
Right. There's parts we know about, and that's what we're gonna step up to and make sure we commit resources to. And then there's parts that we don't, and we're gonna just set those aside.
Yeah. Or we know where our compass is. We know we have a really good idea what declarative rendering looks like.
Right. Handlebars was 100% the best thing that Ember did. Like 100% the best thing.
I was using, what was that? Like a contextual component. And it's just, you're just writing this code and you're just like, how is this like, I'm just describing my template and then exactly how I would talk to someone about it. And then if I need like jump down to a lower level, I can just open up that component and start adding new things that get yielded back out. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Interesting. Good food for thought.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we can wrap this up. Cool. See you next week. If you want to follow us, EmberMap.com is the best place to find us.
Awesome. Thanks for joining.
Bye.